Back to the future. Who do we want to be? Listen to these words from Philippians chapter 3, verses 14 through 21 from the Message. I've got my eye on the goal, where God is beckoning us onward to Jesus. I'm off and running, and I'm not turning back. So let's keep focused on that goal, those of us who want everything God has for us. If any of you have something else in mind, something less than total commitment, God will clear your blurred vision. You'll see it yet. Now that we're on the right track, let's stay on it. Stick with me, friends. Keep track of those you see running the same course, headed for the same goal. There are many out there taking other paths, choosing other goals, and trying to get you to go along with them. Our Savior, the Master, Jesus Christ, he'll make us beautiful and whole with the same powerful skill by which he is putting everything as it should be, under and around him. Some of you may remember the movie Back to the Future, a science fiction film from 1985 starring Michael J. Fox, who played Marty McFly. The year is 1985, and his parents are unhappy, as is young Marty. His father is bullied by his boss. His mother is overweight, depressed, and alcoholic. His life is miserable. Marty meets an eccentric inventor who built a time machine out of a modified DeLorean car. Stuff happens, and Marty accidentally sends himself back to 1955. Where he meets his future parents and ultimately gets them together. His efforts change history so that when he is finally returned to 1985, after many misadventures, of course, his parents are successful, fit, and happy, and everyone lives happily ever after, until the sequel. The movie Back to the Future fixes the past so that the present is made perfect. Maybe many of us here in the church and in society, as well as in our personal lives, think it might be a great thing to be able to fix the past so that the present and even the future will be better than it seems from this vantage point. So much has happened since we gathered last year at annual conference. Uncertainty about who we will be as an annual conference and even a denomination continue to hang over us. Short of a time machine, particularly an ecclesiological time machine, we can't fix the past. But we can reclaim our future when we understand our history so as to be clear about who we are and want to be as followers of Jesus. The image that we have for this annual conference isn't that of DeLorean car, so emblematic of the movie Back to the Future, but the West African Sankofa. The Sankofa is a mythic bird from the tribe in Ghana. It literally means to return to the past, to look, seek, and fetch that which is of risk of being left behind. The Sankofa flies forward into the future while looking backward at who it has been in the past, with an egg in its mouth, symbolizing that future of potential. We often have to go back to the place where we lost our way or our identity in order to regain and fetch who we have been at our best. Then we can go forward, knowing who we are. I think the Sankofa is a beautiful image of what our task is at this point in history in the Northern Illinois Annual Conference and that of the United Methodist Church. And this is a perfect year for us as an annual conference to look back in order to fly forward. It's a year of anniversaries. Tomorrow, we will celebrate 200 years of mission in the Methodist tradition as well as 50 years of Black Methodists for Church Renewal. We will also celebrate 150 years of women's mission in the Methodist tradition, and I'm pleased to have Harriet Olson, the General Secretary of the United Methodist Women, lead us in biblical and historical study of the mission of women tonight and again tomorrow morning. And last but not at all least, it is the 180th anniversary of continuous ministry in the Northern Illinois area of the United Methodist Church and its antecedent bodies. Yes. So I've asked a few people to share some of the themes of our identity and work as an annual conference over the years. It's not a comprehensive history, it's a thematic history. And I hope that these themes will inform us in our conversations and legislation at this annual conference. Let's look back for a few minutes to remember who we've been in order to fly forward.
The Northern Illinois Conference is celebrating 180 years of continuous ministry. In 1803, the Methodist missionary Benjamin Young was appointed to the Illinois area as part of what we call the Western Conference. Circuits were established as settlements popped up across the prairies. Jesse Walker, who has also been called the father of Illinois Methodism, was appointed to the Illinois Circuit in 1806. The Illinois Territory began to grow in population, especially in areas like Sterling, Dixon, Ottawa, Joliet, Plainfield, Des Plaines, and Freeport. The first regular appointment was John Dew to the Galena Mission in 1828. Walker organized a class meeting in Plainfield in 1829. A church was built in Princeton in 1839. The church in Dixon was started by a laywoman, Amanda Talmadge, in 1836, when she and two other women, one Presbyterian, the other Baptist, started and maintained religious services until a circuit rider was appointed. Methodist laity and local preachers were instrumental in organizing churches. The Methodist Protestant Church, the Evangelical Association Church, and the United Brethren Church all began to organize by the end of 1839 and into 1840. By the time the Rock River Conference was established in Mount Morris by Bishop Beverly Walt on August 26, 1840, where there were already 26 charges and 7 known church buildings within its bounds. Throughout this period of time, the focus of the clergy, circuits, and churches was to strengthen the existing charges and establish new circuits. Today, we will call them faith communities. This focus continues to be our conference priority 180 years later. The methods may have changed drastically over the years, but the gospel imperative remains the same.
Settlers who came from the East Coast in Europe desired to reach out to the Native Americans in the area. Jesse Walker, who began to preach and organize a church in the early 1800s, was appointed as a missionary to the Potawatomi Indians in 1825. It's always important to remember that most settlements, and therefore churches, were established only after Black Hawk and his people were pushed across the Mississippi River. The Ho-Chunk, Potawatomi, and Kikpu nations followed. In 1835, the Illinois Potawatomi began their trail of death to Kansas from the gates of Fort Dearborn in today's downtown Chicago. Settlers took over the sacred lands of indigenous peoples. The original boundaries of the Rock River Conference included all of Wisconsin, Upper Michigan, and portions of Minnesota. These areas were homelands of the Ojibwa and Ottawa peoples. 2 preachers in the early years of the Methodist Church in Illinois were Kagigagabao, known as George Copway, a member of the Mississauga Ojibwa Nation, and his cousin Pataquahong, known as Henry P. Chase. At 22 years old, Copway was already a deacon, and Henry Chase was ordained at the 1840 Rock River Conference. Both preachers were both well known at the time in intellectual and literary circles as well as in the church. The Civil War was a troubled time for both the nation and our church. While support for the Civil War was strong in Illinois and most held anti-slavery sentiments, leadership in the country and in the church was also anti-Indian. Much like the wider Methodist Wesleyan history overall, there was a desire to reach out to Native American peoples, but attitudes and methods often caused more harm than good. As a denomination in 2012 and also as an annual conference in 2015, we as an annual conference have carried out acts of repentance for our past actions.
In 1939, the Methodist Protestant Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church, and the Methodist Episcopal Church South, which had split off in the 19th century over slavery, came back together. In doing so, the Methodist Church was created with 5 geographical jurisdictions across the United States, plus a central jurisdiction, which was a segregated place for Black Methodists following the merger. But segregation in the Methodist Church had roots established well before that date. One of the conferences in the central jurisdiction was the Lexington Conference, which included Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. The Chicago district of the Lexington Conference began to be organized as early as 1869 as a separate conference and had 12 churches by the 1920s. St. Mark United Methodist Church in Chicago was organized in 1893 within the Lexington Conference, which became a mother church to other Black churches in Chicagoland. The churches, clergy, conferences, and bishops existed within the Methodist Church, but always at the whim and authority of the Methodist Church/White Conference and its bishops. In 1956, the General Conference approved the 9th Amendment of its Constitution to provide for the dissolution of the central jurisdiction. In 1964, the General Conference approved legislation that permitted the Lexington Conference of the central jurisdiction to merge with the North Central jurisdiction. This was one of the first mergers of the central jurisdiction into the geographical jurisdictional conferences. All 14 churches and 15 pastors within the bounds of the Rock River Conference became a part of the North Central jurisdiction, but full inclusion took many more years, even as we continue to face racism within our church and society today. However, the Rock River Conference strongly declared their commitment to be inclusive, demonstrating that commitment by bringing forth members of the Lexington Conference into the cabinet. The process to dissolve the central jurisdiction took from 1956 until 1972, 16 years. To complete throughout General Church, the former Evangelical United Brethren Church is credited with insisting upon their 1968 merger with the Methodist Church to bring about the total dissolution of the central jurisdiction. In December 1969, a special called session of the NIC recognized the Black Caucus as a program area, challenging the annual conference to encourage self-determination, self-empowerment, and leadership opportunities within the NIC, as well as to develop and to strengthen the Black church in Chicago. This was an effort to challenge NIC to respond to the urban crisis exploding all around us. A statement noted the sin of our age and the consequences judgments upon the UMC is endemic and systemic racism. The Black Caucus came to be known as Black Methodists for Church Renewal, or BMCR. Today, we celebrate 50 years of BMCR's work in the Northern Illinois Conference. Intentional work and ministry to eliminate racism in the church and society needs to continue to be our priority. We will hear more about this when the annual conference shepherding team presents its major goals. Anti-racism efforts require consistent and constant work. Moving into civil rights era, there were a number of white Methodist clergy in the South who were told by their bishops that they need to head north because of their racial views, which were anti-segregation / pro-integration. At that time, a number of Methodist clergy came from the South to NIC, although the exact count is unknown. Some Rock River clergy were active in efforts to desegregate white Southern Methodist churches, such as Reverend Jerry Forshey and Joe Buckles. Later, in the civil rights years of the 1960s, the social justice commitment of many churches and clergy in the NIC became strong. A renewed understanding and articulation of social holiness and personal holiness began to emerge.
After the Northern Central Jurisdiction meeting following the merger of the Evangelical United Brethren and Methodist Church, the Northern Illinois Conference was officially created by name on June 28, 1968. It met for its first session as a uniting conference on September 21, 1968. The United Methodists, as well as the Rock River Conference, is a story of merger and change. As our culture and church change, mergers have brought us together after separation over racial, cultural, and theological differences.
The NIC area has been an immigration destination since the early 19th century and continues to be today. In 1852, the General Conference assigned 2 German districts from Iowa and Wisconsin to the Rock River Conference, which brought 20 German-speaking preachers into the fold, as well as 300 members. A Swedish mission was established in Chicago with at least 50 members. German, Norwegian, and Danish churches were formed into conferences around their shared language in the Rock River Conference area. In 1933, there began a gradual merger of all the language conferences, German, Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian. This process was completed by 1943. Other immigrant and language ministries have flourished in the Rock River/NIC. One is the Korean Church. After the second wave of Korean immigrants to the United States following the formal Japanese occupation of the Korean Peninsula in 1910, immigrants began moving from Hawaii to San Francisco and then Chicago. In September of 1923, Reverend Chang Young Kim, who had studied at Garrett Theological Seminary, held the NIC's first Korean language worship service with 6 members. First Korean UMC was the first Korean church in Chicagoland and the first Korean church in the Midwest. This 96-year-old church grew from 6 worshipers to hundreds. Today, there are over 60,000 Koreans in the Chicagoland area, and the NIC is home to 12 Korean churches. Until around 1920, most Hispanic Latinx Americans resided in the southwestern United States, but they began moving toward the Midwest looking for jobs, and Mexican Americans began to settle in the Chicago area. During World War II in the 1950s, more came to the Chicago area from Puerto Rico. By 2017, the Hispanic population of Chicago alone grew to 800,000, with about 2 million in the state of Illinois. Charles A. Parkin began NIC's first Hispanic ministry in the 1920s with primary outreach to Mexican immigrants. By 1926, an Italian Methodist church named Good Shepherd became a Hispanic ministry. By the mid-1950s, 2 Hispanic youth answered the call to ministry, sought seminary training, and pastored churches, Jose Velasquez and Fines Flores. There are currently 24 Hispanic Latinx ministries, congregations in the NIC. The conference has 2 Hispanic Latinx deacons, 10 elders, and 12 licensed local pastors. With the help of the National Hispanic Latinx Plan of the UMC, of which NIC has provided leadership, United Methodists have placed a renewed emphasis on being a multicultural church family that is God-centered, values all people, and is a vital part of the life of the community by sharing God's love. We have focused on working in the areas of lay, clergy, and youth leadership. Our conference has been a front-runner in providing Hispanic church leadership through the Conference Academy for Faith Community Development, which is a 2-year program for pastors and laypersons who feel called to start a new thing within the NIC Hispanic/Latinx community. Following the UMC's Book of Resolutions and Social Principles, the NIC has supported Sanctuary in Northern Illinois Conference, and 2 churches have declared themselves to be sanctuary churches. Then, as now, growth often comes through immigrant communities in language ministries other than English, including Korean, Spanish, Hindi, Urdu, Telugu, Gujarati, and Tagalog. Our history of ethnic and gender diversity includes the nurturing of leadership to the general church. NIC has produced 3 African American bishops: Charles Jordan, 1992, Jonathan Keaton, 1996, and Tracy Smith Malone, 2016. Over the years, the NIC has had 1 ethnic bishop, Hee Sung Young, 2004-2012, and 1 woman bishop, Sally Dyck, who came in 2012.
From the very beginning of our history, the Northern Illinois Conference has stood for social change. For instance, slavery divided the people called Methodist. In the 1845, this conference took a firm stance against slavery, despite many objections, and sent an official declaration of its stance to the General Conference in the 1850s, prior to the Civil War. While generally sympathetic to the abolition of slavery, not all people agreed with abolition, and it created tensions and even some membership loss. Following the Civil War, the Methodist Church in the NIC area focused on providing care for those who had been enslaved people. In addition to stands against slavery and racism and for civil rights, the NIC has stood with LGBTQIA persons through official statements, legislation, and action to become reconciling. In the early 1970s, some NIC congregations began wrestling with human sexuality in the church when the Book of Discipline declared that, in quotes, homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, end quote. In 1982, the nationally based Reconciling Congregation program organized, working to welcome, affirm, and encourage the full participation of gay and lesbians in church life at all levels. In 1984, Whedon United Methodist Church in Evanston became the first reconciling church in our conference. Now there are 59 of our congregations in the Reconciling Ministries Network, which NIC voted to join itself in 1986. Again, local church, conference, and general conference legislation and action to move the church toward full inclusion of all people has been a constant, even as it has at times created disagreements.
The Northern Illinois Church Conference and its antecedents were instrumental in gender justice. Women from Northern Illinois were influential in moving the general church in its attitudes and acceptance of women in the church, ministry, and mission. Ms. Jenny Fowler Willing was a pastor's wife in the Rockford area who heard the need for women missionaries in 1869. Through her dedicated efforts, Illinois sent a number of women into the mission field during the 19th century as part of the Women's Foreign Missionary Society, strengthening women's leadership as well as missionary endeavors. Ms. Frances Willard, known as the founder of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, sought to improve the social conditions of families in the late 1800s regarding substance abuse. She was a strong advocate for women's education and suffrage in our nation, as well as the full participation of women in the church. In 1888, women wanted to be ordained and hold various decision-making positions within the Methodist Church. Frances Willard was one of the 5 women elected lay delegates to the 1888 General Conference. Although she was not seated, she helped pave the way for the future. But consider that the Rock River Conference voted for her to go as one of their lay delegates, even though they knew there was a good chance she wouldn't be seated. This was groundbreaking for women in the Methodist Church. Lucy Ryder Meyer was the founder of the Deaconess Movement, which is credited for developing the leadership and education of women in general, as well as biblical and theological education through the Chicago Training School, eventually affiliated with Garrett Theological Seminary. Through the Deaconess Movement, Lucy Ryder Meyer is credited with building Wesley Hospital, a children's home, a senior citizens home, a retired deaconess's home, several boarding schools, and a baby fold. As historian J. Gordon Melton writes in his book Log Cabins to Steeples, every single benevolent institution brought by the Rock River Conference to the United Methodist Church was a successful project of Lucy Ryder Meyer. These early contributions by women to the Rock River and General Conference undoubtedly imprinted upon the Northern Illinois Conference a commitment to gender equality, as well as health and welfare institutions to care for the most vulnerable in our communities. Organizations like ChildServe and Rosecrans continue to be an important outreach to the most vulnerable in our communities across the NIC. Of course, the foresight and philanthropy of Mrs. Eliza Clark Garrett enabled Mrs. Garrett's vision for a school to train ministers. Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary stands in her honor, educating countless church leaders since its inception in 1848. Still desiring the ordination of women elders, it was the Women's Missionary Society that took up the cause and formed a committee on the status of women in 1944. Laywomen were strong advocates for the full voice, vote, and rights of women as clergy. The General Conference voted for full ordination rights for women in 1956. Before 1956, the Rock River Conference had experienced women in the pulpit, but not as elders with full clergy rights. The Church of the United Brethren in Christ had been ordaining women since 1896, but when it merged with the Evangelical Church to become the EUB Church, the ordination rights of women were rescinded. Like most change, the ordination of women came with uncertainty and struggle as well as celebration. Even though women in the General Conference had full rights of ordination, there was still resistance, as there is yet today in places, to ordain and appoint women, and many bishops were reluctant to take the lead. Laywomen such as Phyllis Tholen sponsored legislation during the 1974 annual conference, encouraging the appointment of women elders. From the election of Frances Willard to General Conference, to the granting of full clergy rights to Constance Hassentab Elms in the Rock River Conference and Barbara McEwing in the Lexington Conference, the Methodist EUB family in Northern Illinois has recognized God's call for women's full participation in the organizational life of the church.
This brief history can't possibly tell the entire story or lift the names of the Northern Illinois Conference people, clergy, and laity, or raise all the themes of the Northern Illinois Conference over the last 180 years. The gospel remains the same, but over the last 180 years, just about everything else has changed. More than anything, we hope that this brief history will nurture resilience in these uncertain times in our church and in our society. As we have gone back into our history and plucked a few themes of change from our past, we do so to inspire us all in faith, hope, and love.
Northern Illinois, that's who you have been. Yes. And thank you for helping to share our story. Studies indicate that if leaders spend time looking back at their history, what made them who they are, they do a better job of looking forward into the future. In fact, looking back always allows an organization to look further ahead than if you don't consider who you've been. As you heard, we've been and are an annual conference who sought to be more inclusive of others, often ahead of what was happening in the church at large. We have not done all these things perfectly. At times, this conference is rushed out there with enthusiasm, without a sensitivity to what is needed in a more diverse and inclusive church. We've had to grow in our cultural competence related to others. We have hurt others and have been hurt ourselves. Lord, have mercy upon us. But I have to give it to you. At least even in our blunders, we have sought to love kindness, do justice, and most of the time, walk humbly with our God. So this will be yet another critical year in the life of this annual conference and the denomination. And the question that we need to ask over and over again is, who will we be? Over the last few months, we've had gatherings where we learned about the outcomes of General Conference 2019, and I hope that you have followed them. And then the Judicial Council decisions, which I've written in articles and letters and given videos. But even if the Judicial Council had declared the whole traditional plan to be unconstitutional, it would not have been just a reset at where we were in 2016. Something significantly shifted when the traditional plan was approved. As I've said before, I want to say again, it wasn't just the affirmation of traditional marriage, that is a man and a woman. It was the punitive and untraditional penalties toward those of us who differ with equally and deeply held beliefs based on scripture, reason, tradition, and experience around human sexuality. The message from General Conference 2019 was loudly proclaimed and well articulated by Bill Lawrence, a professor of American church history at Southern Methodist University's Perkins School of Theology and a former member of the Judicial Council. He said in a blog, "What the 2019 General Conference reiterated and reinforced is that homosexual persons are welcome to sit in our pews, serve on our committees, sing in our choirs, share our sacraments, supply funds for our activities, sup at our church dinners, schmooze with our visitors, and spend time in our mission projects. But they are not welcome to speak in our pulpits, celebrate our sacraments, stand at our altars to be united in Christian marriage, or say that God is calling them into ordained ministry." Until now, we have lived as a church under one tent, albeit not without tension. But we've kind of been like a family on a camping trip in one tent, shouting and struggling at times. But nevertheless, when the rain pours and the bears circle, we've always managed to come together as a church in mission and outreach. As I've always said, if you're a conservative church, be a fruitful conservative church. If you're a progressive church, be a progressive and fruitful church. We need more points of entry into a message and community of Christ's love and grace, not fewer. At the recent Council of Bishops meeting, the predominant conversation was about how the United Methodist Church under the traditional plan is untenable and unsustainable. Advocates for the traditional plan, as well as those who had hoped for other options like the one church plan or the simple plan, agree that we may need an amicable separation to find a new form of unity. If there are two sides, then both sides agree that we can no longer afford to continue to do harm to each other in regards to human sexuality. As you may know, there are all kinds of conversations going on throughout the United States and the central conferences about developing a new form of unity, which is based on our roots of Methodism, but not linked in polity, or at least polity related to human sexuality. There are other conversations about how to stay and resist. Persons from Northern Illinois have been a part of all of these conversations. And we have a piece of legislation before us, hopefully today, that will empower us to be apprised and participating in what is developing across the connection so that we can fully participate in a future with hope. At this point, this is my personal vision of what I hope happens, my personal vision, that there be some form of affiliation, a plan of affiliation. For instance, an annual conference would decide if it wanted to affiliate as a United Methodist Church under the traditional plan, or, for instance, maybe another affiliation like the simple plan. If an individual local church in that annual conference didn't want to be in affiliation with what that annual conference decided, it could join another annual conference, which affiliated another way. But conversations are only beginning, and there are no proposals. As we discern the future together, another question is raised: how will we be with each other? This is of critical importance. How we are with each other says as much about who we are as anything else. Some of us will resist the traditional plan, and others will want to insist that it's fully enforced. Since once again it does not appear what we shall be, I encourage us to allow everyone to get to the future intact. Let's not be a police state where colleagues and parishioners grow in distrust of each other. This only serves to diminish our witness and mission. Let's not unduly provoke one another, but instead let us do no harm. And as it says in Hebrews 10, verse 24, let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds. So given our history as an annual conference, who will we be? You will find several pieces of legislation that we address today and tomorrow that will afford some conversations about that. Will we seek to live within the United Methodist Church under the traditional plan, resist its outcomes, or work with others in finding another way forward? Your conversations and decisions will mark the journey ahead. In addition to these conversations, we will be determining who we will be in the future by the election of our delegates to General Conference 2020. I urge you to vote for people who have a wide knowledge of how the general church works, not just a single issue. Big decisions will be made at General Conference 2020, and we need to have the very best delegation, which will work long and hard, as this past one has, networking and partnering with others, since we are a small conference. We need delegates who can influence others and build coalitions for a future with hope. So there's much to do this year as an annual conference, but in the meantime, there are people who need us to be in ministry and mission. Some of them care about our stance on human sexuality, but many don't, especially those who are hungry and homeless and flooded or burned out of their homes, or dying from preventable diseases, addiction, or suffering from incarceration, violence, warfare, or gun violence. We cannot take our eyes off the goal of caring for our neighbor. Recently, I read a book entitled Alienated in America: Why Some Places Thrive While Others Collapse by Timothy P. Carney. The author repeatedly and specifically cites that local churches in communities of all kinds are critical to the health and well-being of the communities. Now, mind you, this is not a religious or church consultant book. It's written by a journalist who is analyzing our American culture, socially, economically, and politically. But he maintains that not enough focus is placed on strengthening local churches in these communities that are struggling, because it's actually these churches that are an essential major hub of social networks. Instead, all the focus tends to be on strengthening local economies and increasing jobs. It needs to be both, he maintains. Obviously, the real estate itself of the church isn't what matters, but the impact of that church on the community is what matters. The local church and the health of the community are closely tied. So we need to make sure that we have strong and vital churches in all our communities. Yes, we have a mission to fulfill. So one other piece of legislation will be presented today, which focuses on strengthening our local churches. The annual conference shepherding team has been organized this year and is bringing 3 strategic goals that is identified and which it has identified as essential in making vital congregations that impact vital communities. The first goal is that all local churches need to develop new ways to help members grow in their own discipleship, practicing the spiritual disciplines of our faith and sharing that faith with others. We can't have vital churches that impact vital communities if we don't have vital Christians. You can't just have a vital church. We need vital Christians who are growing in their faith, able to articulate that faith and seek to live as followers of Jesus in these challenging times. A second strategic goal is to live into the conviction that racism is truly that which is incompatible with Christian teaching. How are we as followers of Jesus repenting of and turning from racism, which has been called by some the original sin of America? How are we spreading scriptural holiness across the land as John Wesley commissioned us to do, specifically in the communities where we live? His definition of spreading scriptural holiness was to grow in love of God and our neighbor, no matter who that neighbor is. The third strategic goal addresses our capacity and sustainability as local churches and an annual conference. Friends, our financial capacity and sustainability as an annual conference is vulnerable, starting with many of our local churches. How do we strengthen our local churches in this way? All of these strategic goals, if embraced by all the local churches, with the help and resourcing of district and annual conference shepherding teams, will make us strong and vital Christians with strong and vital congregations that make us a strong and vital annual conference. There is no magic pill that does this work. It's the work of every united Methodist disciple and every local church. Furthermore, this is not the time to weaken our local churches or the annual conference in our response to General Conference 2019. In our strength, we have more options as the denomination itself continues to find a way forward into a preferred future. We have much to do this year. As all this and more will be going on in this transitional year, I encourage you to stay abreast to what is happening through the Northern Illinois Conference and United Methodist News Service reports. I will continue to issue pastoral statements and videos, and we will undoubtedly have gatherings to discuss who we want to be, including at our special annual conference session in the fall on November 16. Finally, this year will be a transitional in other ways. When Marva Andrews and I are just about finished with our work at the end of the day, one of us will inevitably say, well, I've had just about as much fun as I can today. And of course we mean we're packing up and going home. Well, I want to say that in 2020, I will have 41 years of active ministry, serving in 3 annual conferences as a pastor, a district superintendent, or a bishop. While I've never strayed far from I-90, I've seen many faces of the church in urban, rural, and suburban communities. While I've seen some heartbreaking stains upon the witness of Christ in the world, more often than not, I have seen the best of God's people at work in the world. My own world has been expanded by all I have encountered and had the privilege to serve, including you. Oh, the places I've gone and the people I have met, thanks be to God. But as of September 1, 2020, I will have had all the fun I can take. And I will be retiring to beautiful, sunny California, far, far away from I-90. But I just want to remind you, I will be here for a whole nother annual conference year. You're not done with me yet. So as I said, we've got a lot of work to do. So let's stay focused on who we are with our eyes on the goal, where God is beckoning us on. Amen. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. My privilege to serve.